When the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, it was not just the fall of a political system, it was the shattering of a world order that had existed for generations. For over 70 years, the USSR had bound together diverse republics under a single flag, with Moscow at its center. When that structure dissolved, 15 new nations emerged, each facing the challenge of forging an independent path in a world that had grown accustomed to seeing them as part of a larger whole. Among them, Ukraine was one of the most significant, both in size and importance, with over 50 million people, vast stretches of fertile farmland, a powerful industrial base, and strategic ports along the Black Sea. It was a nation whose future would inevitably shape the security and politics of the region. Ukraine's declaration of independence on the 24th of August 1991 was more than symbolic. It was the culmination of decades of national sentiment and a rejection of Moscow's control. The referendum held on the 1st of December 1991 confirmed this choice in overwhelming numbers. More than 90% voted in favor, including a majority in Crimea, a region with deep historical ties to Russia. For Ukrainians, it was a moment of hope and pride. For many Russians, however, it felt like the loss of a brother nation, a rupture in what they saw as a shared historical and cultural identity. Ukraine was not just another Soviet republic. It was, in Russian eyes, the birthplace of the ancient Kievan Rus, the medieval state from which Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus all trace their roots. The new Ukrainian state inherited much from the Soviet system, but one of its most consequential inheritances was the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, over 1,900 strategic warheads, and thousands of tactical nuclear weapons. This stockpile, stationed on Ukrainian soil but under former Soviet command structures, drew intense international attention. Western powers wanted the weapons secured and dismantled. Russia viewed them as part of its own legacy. After years of negotiation, Ukraine agreed to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, surrendering its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. At the time, it seemed like a guarantee of safety. In hindsight, it would be remembered as a promise broken. Independence also brought enormous economic challenges. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a market system was turbulent. Inflation soared into the thousands of percent, wiping out savings. State industries collapsed, unemployment grew, and corruption spread. The rapid privatization process allowed a small group of powerful businessmen, later known as oligarchs, to accumulate immense wealth and influence, shaping politics to suit their interests. For ordinary Ukrainians, the early years of independence were a mix of hardship and cautious optimism. Life was difficult, but for the first time in modern history, Ukraine had the ability to choose its own direction. Yet even in these early years, the relationship with Russia was complicated and uneasy. Trade between the two nations remained vital, especially in energy. Ukraine depended heavily on Russian oil and natural gas, while Russia relied on Ukraine's pipeline network to supply European customers. This mutual dependency created both opportunities for cooperation and points of friction. Disputes over prices, debts, and contracts would flare repeatedly in the years ahead, laying the groundwork for what would later become the infamous gas wars. The most sensitive and potentially dangerous issue, however, lay in Crimea. In 1954, during the Soviet era, Crimea had been transferred from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, a move that was mostly symbolic at the time. After independence, that symbolic gesture suddenly carried real political weight. Crimea was home to a majority Russian-speaking population, many of whom felt stronger cultural ties to Moscow than to Kiev. It was also the base of the Black Sea Fleet, one of the most important components of the former Soviet Navy. The question of who would control this fleet and the strategic port of Sevastopol would soon become the first major confrontation between Russia and Ukraine. In foreign policy, Ukraine tried to walk a careful line. It maintained formal cooperation with Russia through the Commonwealth of Independent States, while also seeking closer ties with Europe, the United States, and international institutions. This balancing act was delicate. In the western regions of Ukraine, there was strong support for greater integration with the European Union and NATO. In the east and south, cultural and economic connections to Russia were more deeply rooted. These internal differences did not yet split the country apart, but they created fault lines that could and eventually would be exploited. In Russia, the early 1990s were marked by political chaos and economic collapse under President Boris Yeltsin, but even amid domestic turmoil, many Russian politicians and thinkers saw Ukraine's independence as temporary. The idea of a Russian world, Ruski Mir, that united all Russian-speaking peoples remained influential, and Ukraine was central to that vision. Officially, Moscow recognized Ukraine's sovereignty, but underneath the diplomatic language was a persistent belief that the two countries were destined to remain bound together. By the end of the decade, it was clear that the post-Soviet settlement between Russia and Ukraine was fragile. The separation had been peaceful in form, but it left unresolved disputes, competing national identities, and deep mistrust. Crimea's status, the control of the Black Sea Fleet, energy dependence, and the question of Ukraine's geopolitical orientation were all simmering issues. The two countries were bound together by history, economics, and geography, but those same ties were also the very points where tensions would erupt. Beneath the surface of official treaties and trade agreements, the seeds of future conflict had already taken root, waiting for the right moment to grow into open confrontation. After independence, Ukraine and Russia were tied together by more than just history and geography. They were bound by the presence of the Soviet Union's Black Sea Fleet, a naval force of enormous strategic and symbolic importance. The fleet's main base was in Sevastopol, Crimea, a city with a long military tradition and deep emotional significance in Russian history. It had been the scene of famous sieges in the Crimean War and World War II, and for many Russians, it was not merely a port, but a national monument. Now, with the collapse of the USSR, Sevastopol and the entire Crimean Peninsula were under the sovereignty of an independent Ukraine. This was a reality that Moscow struggled to accept. The division of the fleet became the first major post-Soviet conflict between the two nations. At the time of the USSR's breakup, the Black Sea Fleet consisted of hundreds of ships, submarines, aircraft, and tens of thousands of personnel. Many of the sailors and officers were Russian by nationality, but their bases, housing, and infrastructure were now on Ukrainian soil. The question of ownership was politically explosive. Ukraine insisted that as an independent state, it had the right to control all military assets within its territory. Russia argued that the fleet was a shared Soviet legacy and should remain under joint or Russian command. In the early 1990s, both sides tried to avoid open confrontation, but tensions were high. Ukrainian authorities sought to establish their own navy, raising their flag over ships stationed in Crimean ports. In response, Russian commanders often refused to acknowledge Ukrainian authority, keeping the Russian tricolor flying and maintaining loyalty to Moscow. In some cases, crews were split, with sailors pledging allegiance to different governments. This created confusion, standoffs, and occasional acts of defiance that tested the fragile relationship between Kiev and Moscow. The dispute over Sevastopol was particularly intense. Russia saw the city as its rightful naval base, regardless of Ukraine's independence. In 1993, the Russian parliament went so far as to pass a resolution declaring Sevastopol a Russian city, an act that Ukraine condemned as a violation of its sovereignty. The move inflamed nationalist sentiment on both sides and risked pushing the two countries toward direct military confrontation. While neither government wanted an armed clash so soon after the Soviet collapse, political rhetoric was hardening and mutual trust was eroding. Complicating matters further was Crimea's own political climate. Many Crimean residents, the majority of whom were Russian-speaking, were sympathetic to Moscow's position. Separatist movements began calling for greater autonomy or even reunification with Russia. Although Ukraine retained formal control over the peninsula, these movements added another layer of pressure, making the fleet dispute not just a military and diplomatic issue, but also a domestic political challenge for Kiev. For years, negotiations dragged on without a comprehensive solution. In the meantime, incidents continued. Disputes over ship transfers, control of facilities, and the status of personnel were frequent. Both sides maintained a delicate balance, pushing their claims without crossing the line into outright war. International actors, particularly Western nations, watched closely, worried that a military clash in the Black Sea could destabilize the entire post-Soviet region. A breakthrough finally came in 1997 when Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma and Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed a set of agreements known as the Partition Treaty. Under this deal, the Black Sea Fleet was formally divided. Russia would receive the majority of the ships and retain the right to lease naval facilities in Sevastopol for 20 years, while Ukraine would receive a smaller portion of the fleet to serve as the foundation of its own navy. The treaty also confirmed that Crimea remained part of Ukraine, though Russia's continued military presence there kept the region under Moscow's influence. While the agreement resolved the immediate dispute, it was not a true settlement of underlying tensions. Russia's presence in Sevastopol ensured that Crimea would remain a point of leverage in future relations. For Ukraine, the arrangement was a compromise, one that maintained peace, but at the cost of having a foreign military entrenched on its territory. The memory of the fleet dispute lingered in both capitals as a reminder that sovereignty, territory, and military control were issues far from settled. In hindsight, the Black Sea Fleet conflict of the 1990s was an early warning of the deeper geopolitical struggle that lay ahead. It revealed the difficulty Russia had in accepting Ukraine's full independence, the strategic importance of Crimea in Russian military thinking, and the willingness of both sides to push their claims to the brink. Although the dispute ended without shots fired, it planted seeds of mistrust and rivalry that would resurface in far more dangerous forms in the years to come. In the early 2000s, Ukraine found itself at a crossroads, a nation still grappling with the consequences of independence while attempting to carve out its own identity on the world stage. Economically, the country was struggling to transition from a Soviet-style planned system to a market economy. Industries that had once thrived under centralized control now faced disarray, and unemployment and inflation remained persistent problems. Corruption had become deeply embedded within the political and economic structures, and oligarchs, business magnates, who had amassed enormous wealth during privatization, wielded significant influence over both politics and media. Yet, even amid these difficulties, the Ukrainian people harbored a growing sense of political awakening and a desire to assert their national sovereignty in ways that had never been possible under Soviet rule. One of the most defining moments of this period came with the presidential election of 2004, a contest that would illuminate the deep fault lines in Ukrainian society and highlight the ongoing struggle between pro-Western and pro-Russian forces. The election pitted Viktor Yanukovych, a politician with strong backing from Moscow and a platform promising stability and close ties with Russia, against Viktor Yushchenko, a reformist candidate advocating for democracy, anti-corruption measures, and integration with Europe. From the outset, the campaign was intensely polarized. The media became a battlefield, and reports of vote manipulation, intimidation, and fraud were widespread. The stakes were high not just for Ukraine's future, but for the regional balance of power, as Moscow closely monitored developments and intervened subtly to support Yanukovych's candidacy. The election took a dramatic and chilling turn when Yushchenko was suddenly and mysteriously poisoned with dioxin, leaving him disfigured and hospitalized for months. The attack shocked the nation and the world, raising suspicions of political assassination attempts linked to either internal rivals or external influence from Moscow. Rather than ending his political ambitions, the poisoning transformed Yushchenko into a potent symbol of resistance against corruption, authoritarianism, and foreign interference. Public sympathy surged in his favor, energizing a movement that would come to define Ukrainian political activism for years to come. On the 21st of November 2004, when official election results declared Yanukovych the winner, outrage swept across the nation. Kyiv's Independence Square, which would later become famously known as Maidan, filled with hundreds of thousands of protesters clad in the orange color of Yushchenko's campaign. These protesters represented a broad spectrum of Ukrainian society, students, professionals, and ordinary citizens united in demanding fairness, transparency, and respect for democratic principles. The movement, which became known as the Orange Revolution, was notable not only for its size, but for its peaceful persistence. Despite freezing winter temperatures, participants erected tents, maintained round-the-clock demonstrations, and organized rallies and marches that stretched for weeks. The Orange Revolution quickly drew international attention. Western nations expressed support for the demonstrators' calls for democratic reform, seeing it as a hopeful sign of a fledgling democracy asserting itself in a historically authoritarian region. Russia, however, reacted with alarm. The Kremlin perceived the protests as a direct challenge to its influence, accusing Western governments of meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs and framing the movement as a destabilizing force orchestrated from abroad. Moscow's response was a clear signal: Ukraine's political trajectory mattered deeply to Russia, and any shift away from Moscow's sphere of influence would be closely opposed, whether diplomatically, economically, or covertly. Amid the demonstrations, Ukraine's Supreme Court intervened, annulling the fraudulent election results and ordering a rerun. In the December revote, Yushchenko emerged victorious, a triumph that many celebrated as a rare victory for popular protest in post-Soviet politics. However, the euphoria of victory masked enduring challenges. The Orange Revolution had revealed deep divisions within the country, while the western regions leaned strongly toward Europe and reform. The eastern and southern regions, with larger Russian-speaking populations, retained pro-Russian sentiments and skepticism toward rapid westernization. Governance after the revolution proved difficult. Corruption and economic stagnation persisted, and the initial hope for sweeping reforms often gave way to political gridlock. For Russia, the outcome of the Orange Revolution was a stark warning. Moscow had long viewed Ukraine as a critical part of its historical, cultural, and geopolitical sphere. The revolution, with its popular mobilization and pro-Western orientation, represented a loss of influence and a potential threat to Russian domestic politics. The Kremlin would take note of the strategies and networks that had enabled such mass protests, viewing them as precedents that could inspire similar movements within Russia itself. From that moment on, Russia's approach to Ukraine became increasingly assertive, using economic pressure, energy dependencies, political alliances, and, in later years, covert measures to counteract Ukrainian moves toward Europe and NATO. The Orange Revolution was more than an election dispute. It was a defining episode that highlighted the fragility of Ukraine's democracy, the intensity of its geopolitical tug-of-war, and the determination of its people to resist external control. It set the stage for the ongoing struggle over Ukraine's identity and sovereignty. The events of 2004 deepened mistrust between Kiev and Moscow and established patterns of political contention, foreign influence, and internal division that would echo in later conflicts, including the Euromaidan protests of 2013, 2014, and the eventual escalation into open war. In hindsight, the Orange Revolution was both a victory and a warning, a moment of empowerment for the Ukrainian people, but also a clear signal that Russia would not easily relinquish its ambitions in what it considered its historic backyard. By 2010, Ukraine was still struggling to find a stable political path after the Orange Revolution. The divisions revealed in 2004 had not disappeared. If anything, they had deepened. Viktor Yanukovych, the very candidate whose contested victory had sparked the revolution 6 years earlier, returned to power through a presidential election, this time under circumstances largely deemed legitimate by international observers. His campaign emphasized promises of economic growth, stability, and closer ties with Russia, positions that appealed strongly to voters in the eastern and southern regions, where Russian language and culture were more prevalent, and where economic connections with Moscow remained vital. Yanukovych's victory reflected the enduring East-West divide within Ukraine. The western regions, influenced by European historical ties and a strong nationalist sentiment, generally supported democratic reform and alignment with the European Union. The eastern and southern parts, in contrast, maintained a cultural affinity with Russia and prioritized pragmatic economic and political relationships with Moscow. This internal polarization meant that any policy decision, especially those involving foreign alignment, risked triggering widespread discontent or protest. One of the most critical flashpoints during Yanukovych's presidency was the question of Ukraine's orientation toward the European Union versus closer ties with Russia. In late 2013, the government faced a pivotal decision whether to sign an association agreement with the European Union, a deal that promised deeper economic and political integration with Europe, or to strengthen its partnership with Russia, which was offering significant economic incentives, including reduced gas prices and financial aid. The decision carried profound implications not just for trade, but for Ukraine's sovereignty, national identity, and geopolitical position. In November 2013, Yanukovych abruptly suspended preparations to sign the EU agreement, citing pressure from Russia. This decision sparked immediate outrage among pro-European Ukrainians, particularly in Kiev, and ignited a wave of mass protests in what would become known as the Euromaidan movement. Citizens from all walks of life, students, professionals, and ordinary residents, gathered in Independence Square, demanding government transparency, accountability, and a clear orientation toward Europe. The movement quickly expanded in size and scope, encompassing broader grievances against corruption, cronyism, and the authoritarian tendencies of Yanukovych's administration. The protests were met with escalating violence. Government forces deployed riot police, resulting in clashes that left dozens dead and hundreds injured. Despite the brutality, the demonstrators refused to disperse. Tents and barricades filled the square, and the movement drew global attention, becoming a symbol of popular resistance in the fight for democratic values. International actors, particularly the European Union and the United States, expressed support for the protesters, while Russia criticized the movement as a Western-backed coup attempt, reinforcing its perception of Ukraine as a zone of strategic influence that must remain aligned with Moscow. As the crisis deepened, Yanukovych's political support eroded rapidly. In February 2014, after months of protests, violent clashes, and a dramatic loss of legitimacy, he fled Kyiv. The Ukrainian parliament declared him unable to fulfill his duties and installed an interim government, signaling a dramatic shift in political power. This moment of upheaval, however, also triggered a chain reaction in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian sentiments were strong, and Moscow viewed the new government in Kyiv as illegitimate. In Crimea, the situation escalated quickly. The peninsula, with its majority Russian-speaking population and strategic Black Sea ports, became the focal point of Russian intervention. Unmarked troops, later confirmed to be Russian forces, took control of key installations, effectively seizing control without facing significant resistance. A controversial referendum was organized under Russian supervision, and in March 2014, Russia formally annexed Crimea. The international community largely condemned the move as a violation of international law, but the action was a clear demonstration of Moscow's willingness to assert its influence by force when it perceived its interests were threatened. At the same time, pro-Russian separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine began to rise up, seizing government buildings and declaring independence from Kyiv. These actions marked the beginning of the Donbas conflict, a war that would rage for years, drawing in Russian military support, volunteers, and equipment. The annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of fighting in Donbas represented a dramatic escalation in the long-standing tensions between Russia and Ukraine, turning what had been political disputes and protests into full-scale territorial and military conflicts. By the end of 2014, Ukraine was confronting multiple crises simultaneously: the loss of Crimea, the ongoing war in its eastern regions, a fractured political landscape, economic hardship, and the challenge of maintaining sovereignty in the face of direct foreign intervention. The events of 2010-2014 demonstrated the fragile balance of Ukrainian politics, the enduring influence of Russia, and the profound stakes involved in the country's choice between European integration and alignment with Moscow. The decisions made during this period would not only shape Ukraine's immediate future, but also set the stage for the full-scale invasion that Russia would launch years later, as the unresolved tensions of this period remained unresolved and simmering beneath the surface. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in March 2014, Ukraine faced a crisis unlike any it had experienced since independence. The seizure of the peninsula was not only a blow to national pride and sovereignty, but also a strategic disaster. Crimea held the majority of the Black Sea Fleet's key ports, vital infrastructure, and energy resources. The international community condemned the move, with the United Nations General Assembly passing a resolution affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity. But the political and military realities on the ground had already shifted irreversibly. Moscow's action made clear that Ukraine's borders were no longer guaranteed and that Russia was willing to use force to secure its perceived interests. Almost immediately, the unrest spread to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in eastern Ukraine, collectively known as the Donbass. These areas, heavily industrialized and predominantly Russian-speaking, became the epicenter of a pro-Russian insurgency. Local militants seized government buildings, declaring the creation of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. The Ukrainian government, caught off guard and militarily underprepared, struggled to respond effectively. The situation quickly escalated into armed conflict, with irregular militias backed by Russian volunteers, and according to multiple reports, Russian military personnel and equipment facing off against Ukrainian forces. The war in Donbass was characterized by a mixture of conventional and unconventional warfare. Urban centers became battlegrounds, with heavy artillery, tanks, and small arms deployed alongside cyber attacks and propaganda campaigns aimed at influencing both local populations and international opinion. Cities such as Donetsk, Luhansk, Mariupol, and others suffered extensive destruction, and thousands of civilians were killed or displaced. The conflict drew attention not just from the Ukrainian and Russian governments, but also from global powers, as Western nations imposed sanctions on Russia and provided varying levels of political and economic support to Ukraine. The Ukrainian military, initially fragmented and under-equipped, underwent rapid mobilization. Volunteer battalions emerged, composed of citizens motivated by patriotism and a desire to defend their homeland. These forces, while brave and determined, often lacked formal training, leading to uneven effectiveness on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Ukraine's government faced the dual challenge of prosecuting a war while managing an economy strained by years of corruption, stagnation, and disruption from the conflict. Inflation and unemployment surged, infrastructure was damaged, and trust in political institutions eroded further, complicating efforts to maintain national unity and stability. In an attempt to halt the fighting, international actors mediated ceasefire agreements. The Minsk Protocol signed in September 2014 and the follow-up Minsk-Bisekta Agreement in February 2015 laid out a framework for a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and constitutional reforms, granting special status to certain areas of Donbass. However, these agreements were fragile, violations were frequent, Fighting continued in pockets along the front lines, and political reconciliation remained elusive. Both sides accused the other of failing to comply, and trust between Kiev and Moscow reached new lows. The conflict also created a humanitarian crisis. Millions of people were internally displaced, living in temporary shelters or fleeing to other regions of Ukraine and neighboring countries. Access to basic necessities, healthcare, and education was severely disrupted, especially in areas under active combat. The social fabric of the Donbass region was fractured, and the psychological toll of the war on civilians and soldiers alike would reverberate for generations. For Russia, the Donbass conflict served multiple strategic purposes. It allowed Moscow to maintain leverage over Kiev, destabilize the government, and prevent Ukraine from moving closer to the European Union and NATO. At the same time, Russia sought to project an image of protecting Russian-speaking populations abroad, framing its involvement as defensive rather than aggressive. This narrative, while widely disputed internationally, played an important role in domestic politics, helping the Kremlin maintain popular support amid growing tensions with the West. By the end of 2015, Ukraine had entered a protracted and complex war. Crimea was firmly under Russian control, the Donbass remained contested, and the country faced both external threats and internal divisions. The events following the annexation revealed the depth of Russia's determination to assert its influence and highlighted the vulnerabilities in Ukraine's political and military structures. The conflict in eastern Ukraine was no longer a regional skirmish. It was a sustained geopolitical struggle with international implications, signaling that the post-Soviet order in Eastern Europe was far from stable and that the struggle for Ukraine's sovereignty was only beginning. Following the initial escalation of the war in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine entered a period of prolonged instability from 2016 to 2021. While large-scale battles had subsided in many areas, thanks to ceasefire agreements like Minsk II, the conflict remained unresolved. Frontline skirmishes, artillery exchanges, and sniper fire continued to plague eastern Ukraine, creating a state of frozen conflict that drained resources, disrupted daily life, and maintained high tensions between Kiev and Moscow. Civilians living near the front lines faced constant danger, shortages of food and medicine, and the trauma of displacement, while the psychological burden of living in a semi-war zone weighed heavily on the population. During this period, Ukraine worked to strengthen its military and governance structures. Lessons from the early years of the war prompted reforms in defense strategy, troop organization, and logistics. Volunteer battalions were gradually integrated into formal military units, and international training programs, particularly from NATO member states, helped improve operational readiness. However, despite these efforts, the Ukrainian armed forces remained outmatched in heavy equipment and artillery compared to Russia-backed forces. This imbalance underscored Ukraine's continued vulnerability and reliance on international political and economic support. Energy politics became another major arena of conflict. Ukraine's dependence on Russian natural gas had long been a point of leverage for Moscow, and during this period, Russia used pricing, transit, and supply disputes as tools to exert political pressure. While Ukraine diversified some of its energy sources and sought closer ties with European suppliers, the complex network of pipelines and entrenched contracts meant that energy dependence remained a constant challenge. These disputes highlighted how economic tools could be wielded as instruments of influence, deepening the geopolitical tension beyond the battlefield. Politically, Ukraine navigated a difficult balancing act between reform and stability. President Petro Poroshenko, elected in 2014 following the ousting of Yanukovych, prioritized European integration, anti-corruption measures, and efforts to decentralize governance in line with the Minsk agreements. While some progress was made, entrenched corruption, bureaucratic inertia, and the ongoing war limited the effectiveness of reforms. Pro-Russian sentiment persisted in parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, complicating national cohesion and fueling political divisions. International relations remained a central factor. The European Union and the United States continued to provide economic aid, military assistance, and political backing, while Russia maintained its support for separatist movements in Donbass and strengthened its military presence near the border. Sanctions imposed on Russia in response to Crimea and Donbass created economic friction, but failed to compel Moscow to alter its strategic objectives. Ukraine's foreign policy had to balance the desire for closer European integration with the immediate need to manage a hostile neighbor on its eastern frontier. Socially and culturally, the ongoing conflict reinforced a distinct sense of Ukrainian identity, particularly in areas outside Russian influence. Language, education, and national symbols became markers of sovereignty and resistance, while historical narratives emphasizing Ukraine's independence and struggle against foreign domination gained prominence. These cultural shifts were not merely symbolic, they had practical implications for governance, military cohesion, and national morale. By 2021, Ukraine had stabilized in relative terms, but remained in a precarious position. The front lines in Donbass had solidified, creating a tense equilibrium that prevented either side from gaining decisive ground. Crimea remained under Russian control, heavily militarized, and effectively annexed. Energy dependence, political polarization, and the threat of renewed escalation kept Ukraine on alert, while Moscow's intentions remained clear. Ukraine's westward shift was unacceptable, and Russia would use a combination of military, economic, and political means to maintain influence. The period between 2016 and 2021 was a slow-burning chapter in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, characterized by stalemate, structural reforms, and ongoing tension. It demonstrated the complexity of modern hybrid warfare, where military action, economic pressure, political maneuvering, and cultural influence intersect. For Ukraine, it was a time of cautious resilience, a period in which the country learned hard lessons about sovereignty, defense, and international diplomacy. But beneath the surface of this fragile stability, the unresolved disputes and simmering animosity ensured that the stage was set for future escalation, a reality that would manifest dramatically in the full-scale invasion of 2022. By late 2021, the fragile stability that had defined Ukraine since the Minsk agreements was beginning to unravel. Tensions along the eastern border and in Crimea had been simmering for years, but intelligence reports and satellite imagery indicated a dramatic and unprecedented buildup of Russian troops, armor, and artillery. Estimates suggested that over 100,000 Russian soldiers, supported by tanks, missile systems, and logistical equipment, were positioned near Ukraine's borders. The scale of the deployment was alarming, signaling not just a warning, but the potential for a full-scale invasion. The geopolitical context was critical to understanding this moment. For years, Russia had expressed deep concern about NATO's eastward expansion, particularly the possibility of Ukraine joining the alliance. Moscow viewed Ukraine as a strategic buffer between Russia and Western Europe, and any alignment with NATO or the EU was seen as a direct threat to national security. The Kremlin's narrative framed its actions as defensive and protective of Russian-speaking populations, but the international community interpreted the troop buildup as aggressive posturing that could destabilize Europe. Diplomatically, attempts to defuse the situation were largely unsuccessful. Western nations, including the United States and members of the European Union, issued warnings and offered support to Ukraine, emphasizing that any attack would trigger severe sanctions. Russian officials dismissed these warnings, insisting that the military exercises near the border were routine and that Ukraine itself was responsible for escalating tensions. Behind the public statements, however, Russia's strategic objectives were clear: to exert pressure on Kiev, prevent further integration with Western institutions, and if necessary, change the territorial status quo by force. Within Ukraine, the political and military leadership faced immense pressure. President Volodymyr Zelensky, elected in 2019, had campaigned on a platform of anti-corruption, reform, and peace in the East, but the Russian buildup rendered diplomacy increasingly difficult. Ukrainian forces, though modernized and trained with NATO assistance, were still outnumbered and outgunned in comparison to Russia's formidable military. Mobilization efforts intensified, with the government calling on reservists, reinforcing defenses in Donbass, and preparing for the possibility of multiple fronts. Civilians were also advised on emergency measures, including evacuation plans and civil defense procedures, signaling the gravity of the situation. Public sentiment in Ukraine was a mixture of anxiety and determination. Years of conflict in Donbass had hardened the population, fostering resilience and national unity in the face of external threats. Civil society organizations, volunteers, and local defense initiatives mobilized quickly, reinforcing the military's efforts. At the same time, the memory of Crimea's annexation and the ongoing war in eastern Ukraine weighed heavily, creating a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The population understood that the stakes were existential. Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence were all at risk. Internationally, the buildup sparked a flurry of diplomatic activity. Western leaders held emergency meetings, coordinated sanctions, and delivered strategic aid to Ukraine, including intelligence sharing, defensive weapons, and advisory support. Russia, meanwhile, maintained a mix of deniable operations and public threats, blending military intimidation with propaganda campaigns aimed at both domestic and foreign audiences. The narrative emphasized historical ties, protection of ethnic Russians, and opposition to Western encroachment, framing potential aggression as justified and necessary. By early 2022, the situation reached a breaking point. Diplomatic channels had failed to resolve core disputes, military forces were fully positioned for rapid action, and rhetoric on both sides was increasingly uncompromising. Russia's objectives were clear: to assert control over Ukraine's strategic territories, prevent further Western alignment, and secure its influence over the post-Soviet space. For Ukraine and its allies, the challenge was stark: how to defend sovereignty against a superior military power while navigating a highly complex international landscape. The stage was set for a full-scale invasion, a turning point that would escalate the conflict from a prolonged regional stalemate into a massive and internationally consequential war. The buildup of 2021-2022 was not simply a military maneuver, it was the culmination of decades of unresolved tensions, historical grievances, and geopolitical rivalry. Ukraine's resilience, Russia's strategic calculations, and the responses of the international community would all converge in the coming weeks, determining the course of Eastern Europe for years to come. On the 24th of February, 2022, the long anticipated escalation finally arrived. Russia launched a full scale invasion of Ukraine, marking the most dramatic and consequential phase in the conflict that had been simmering for decades. In the early hours, missiles struck military bases, airports, and key infrastructure across the country, while Russian ground forces advanced from multiple directions, including from Crimea, the eastern regions of Donbass, and Belarus to the north. The scale and speed of the assault shocked the international community, signaling a stark shift from the localized fighting of Donbass to a nationwide war threatening Ukraine's very existence. The initial phase of the invasion focused on Kiev, the political and symbolic heart of Ukraine. Russian forces aimed to quickly decapitate the Ukrainian government, expecting a swift collapse of resistance. Armored columns moved through northern towns, supported by air and artillery strikes, attempting to encircle the capital. The plan, however, underestimated the resilience and determination of Ukrainian forces and civilians alike. Checkpoints were established, volunteer battalions and reservists mobilized, and ordinary citizens took up arms in defense of their neighborhoods. Civilians built barricades, distributed supplies, and created improvised defense units, transforming urban areas into fortified zones of resistance. Elsewhere in the country, battles erupted in Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other key cities. Mariupol, in particular, became a symbol of the humanitarian toll of the conflict. Encircled by Russian forces, the city endured weeks of relentless bombardment, with essential services cut off, hospitals and schools damaged or destroyed, and tens of thousands of civilians trapped under siege conditions. Reports of mass casualties, destruction, and forced evacuations highlighted the catastrophic human cost of the invasion. Across the nation, millions of Ukrainians were displaced, fleeing westward towards safer regions in neighboring countries, creating one of the largest refugee crises in Europe since World War II. Despite Russia's initial advantages in numbers, equipment, and firepower, Ukrainian resistance proved far stronger than anticipated. Well-coordinated military strategies, extensive use of anti-tank and anti-air weapons, and intelligence support from Western allies slowed Russian advances. Urban warfare, logistical challenges, and high Russian casualties undermined Moscow's initial plans for a rapid victory. Ukrainian forces leveraged local knowledge and guerrilla-style tactics to defend key cities, disrupting supply lines and striking at overstretched Russian units. The resilience of the Ukrainian military and civilian population became a defining feature of the early months of the war. Internationally, the invasion triggered a wave of unprecedented response. Western nations imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia, targeting banks, oligarchs, and key industries. Military aid, intelligence sharing, and humanitarian support flowed to Ukraine from Europe, the United States, and other allies. Simultaneously, International organizations coordinated efforts to provide relief to refugees and document war crimes. Diplomatic channels were flooded with urgent negotiations, yet there was little immediate progress toward a ceasefire or peace settlement. The conflict also exposed the global stakes of the war. Energy markets, already fragile, were disrupted as Europe faced Russian gas supply uncertainties. Food exports from Ukraine, particularly grain, were severely impacted, raising concerns about global food security. Politically, nations around the world were forced to navigate a complex landscape, balancing condemnation of Russian aggression with fears of broader escalation. The invasion's ramifications quickly extended far beyond Ukraine's borders, reshaping alliances, security policies, and the international order. By the end of the initial months of the invasion, the war had already transformed Ukraine. Cities lay in ruins, populations were displaced, and the economy was severely strained. Yet the spirit of resistance remained unbroken. Kiev, which had been the primary target for a swift takeover, remained under Ukrainian control, serving as both a strategic stronghold and a symbol of national defiance. The conflict had evolved from a predictable regional confrontation into a full-scale war with devastating humanitarian consequences and profound geopolitical implications, signaling that the struggle for Ukraine's sovereignty was entering its most intense and decisive phase. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine continued through 2022, the humanitarian consequences became increasingly severe, casting a shadow over Europe and the world. Millions of civilians were forced to flee their homes, seeking safety in other regions of Ukraine or in neighboring countries such as Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia. Entire communities were displaced, and cities that had once been vibrant, centers of commerce, education, and culture were reduced to rubble. Schools, hospitals, and residential buildings were destroyed in relentless artillery and missile strikes, leaving families struggling to find shelter, clean water, and medical care. Humanitarian corridors were often disrupted by ongoing combat, leaving thousands trapped in besieged areas with little access to basic necessities. The refugee crisis that emerged from the war was unprecedented in modern Europe. Nations bordering Ukraine mobilized quickly to receive and support millions of displaced people. Temporary shelters, food distribution centers, and medical facilities were established to meet urgent needs. International organizations, including the United Nations, the Red Cross, and numerous non-governmental organizations, coordinated relief efforts, but the scale of displacement presented extraordinary logistical challenges. Families were separated, children were unable to attend school, and countless individuals faced uncertainty about when or if they could return home. Within Ukraine, civilians also took on crucial roles in the war effort. Ordinary citizens participated in local defense initiatives, organized volunteer networks to supply the front lines, and provided aid to displaced neighbors. Community solidarity became a lifeline in many areas, as local leaders and volunteers coordinated everything from food distribution to medical evacuation. Despite the dangers, many Ukrainians remained committed to resisting the invasion, demonstrating resilience that garnered admiration around the world. Internationally, the conflict provoked swift and forceful responses. Western nations imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial institutions, key industries, and elite individuals with close ties to the Kremlin. Military aid, including defensive weapons, drones, and intelligence support, flowed to Ukraine, enabling its forces to sustain resistance and slow Russian advances. Diplomatic efforts, however, faced limitations. Russia remained intransigent, framing the war as a defensive necessity to protect Russian-speaking populations and counter NATO's influence. The global community was forced to navigate a complex geopolitical landscape, balancing condemnation of aggression with the risk of escalation into a broader conflict. The war also had profound effects on the global economy. Ukraine, often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe, faced severe disruptions in its agricultural exports, particularly grain, affecting food supply chains worldwide. Energy markets were destabilized as Europe reduced dependence on Russian gas, prompting price volatility and urgent discussions about energy security. The conflict underscored the interconnectivity of global systems, showing how a regional war could ripple across continents, affecting millions of people far from the battlefield. Amid the destruction, stories of courage, resilience, and solidarity emerged. Ukrainian medical workers risked their lives to treat the wounded in makeshift hospitals. Volunteer groups rescued civilians from occupied towns. Journalists documented the horrors of war, bringing the human cost to international attention and generating widespread empathy. Social media amplified these stories, enabling the global public to witness the realities of the conflict in real time, galvanizing support and humanitarian assistance. Despite international aid and sanctions, the war remained far from resolved. Russian forces consolidated positions in occupied territories, while Ukrainian forces counterattacked strategically to reclaim key areas. The conflict became a drawn-out struggle marked by attrition, destruction, and ongoing uncertainty. Civilians continued to bear the brunt, facing daily threats from bombardment, disrupted services, and the psychological trauma of living in a war zone. By late 2022 and into 2023, it was clear that the humanitarian crisis was one of the most significant aspects of the conflict. Millions of lives had been uprooted, countless communities destroyed, and the social fabric of Ukraine deeply affected. The war had become not only a struggle for territory and political control, but also a test of human resilience, international solidarity, and global responsibility. The world watched as Ukraine endured both the immediate devastation of warfare and the long-term challenges of displacement, economic disruption, and the fight to maintain its sovereignty and identity amid an ongoing existential threat. By early 2023, the war in Ukraine had entered a new phase, defined by intense Ukrainian counteroffensives and shifting dynamics on the front lines. After months of brutal fighting and heavy losses, Ukraine's military, strengthened by Western training, intelligence, and weaponry, began mounting more coordinated and strategic operations to reclaim territory occupied by Russian forces. These counteroffensives were carefully planned, leveraging both conventional warfare and innovative tactics, including the use of drones, long-range artillery, and precision strikes against logistical hubs, supply lines, and command centers. One of the key aspects of Ukraine's success was its ability to adapt to a protracted conflict. Unlike the early days of the 2022 invasion, when Russian forces relied on overwhelming numbers and rapid advances, Ukraine capitalized on local knowledge, mobility, and civilian support. Volunteers and local militias played crucial roles in reconnaissance, sabotage, and civilian protection, turning ordinary citizens into essential contributors to the war effort. Urban centers that had been under Russian control became focal points for resistance, with Ukrainian forces launching operations to disrupt supply lines, isolate units, and gradually push invaders back. The counteroffensives also highlighted the importance of international support. Western nations provided advanced weapon systems, including anti-tank missiles, drones, and air defense systems, which allowed Ukrainian forces to counteract the advantages of Russian heavy armor and artillery. Intelligence sharing was another critical factor, enabling precise targeting and reducing civilian casualties. Economic sanctions continued to strain Russia's ability to sustain prolonged operations, while humanitarian aid helped maintain civilian morale and stabilize regions affected by conflict. The front lines, however, remained fluid and unpredictable. Russian forces, despite setbacks, maintained significant defensive positions and continued to launch artillery strikes, missile attacks, and air raids. The conflict remained a war of attrition, with high casualties on both sides and widespread destruction of infrastructure. Towns and villages were repeatedly contested, leaving civilians caught between shifting zones of control and facing ongoing risks of injury, displacement, and deprivation. The political implications of Ukraine's counteroffensives were profound. Successes on the battlefield strengthened the resolve of both the government and the population, demonstrating that resistance was possible even against a larger and better equipped adversary. The Ukrainian government used these victories to consolidate domestic support, boost morale, and galvanize international backing. For Russia, the setbacks challenged the narrative of swift victory, exposing strategic miscalculations and logistical weaknesses, and prompting internal debate over the conduct and objectives of the war. Globally, Ukraine's resilience reshaped perceptions of the conflict. Nations around the world witnessed how a smaller, determined country could leverage innovation, international alliances, and civilian solidarity to resist a major military power. The ongoing war prompted reevaluations of defense strategies, energy security, and geopolitical alliances, with Europe and the United States increasing support for Ukraine and reassessing the security landscape in Eastern Europe. At the same time, the humanitarian crisis continued unabated. Civilians remained at extreme risk, with infrastructure destroyed, essential services disrupted, and millions displaced both internally and across borders. The psychological toll of the conflict, trauma, fear, and uncertainty affected every aspect of daily life. Yet the war also strengthened national identity, unity, and resilience as Ukrainians rallied to defend their homeland, preserve culture, and assert sovereignty in the face of aggression. By mid-2023, Ukraine's counteroffensives had shifted the momentum on certain fronts, reclaiming towns and territory previously under Russian occupation. While the conflict remained far from resolved, these operations demonstrated that the war was not a one-sided struggle and that the balance of power could be contested through strategic planning, international support, and national determination. The stage was set for a prolonged struggle in which military, political, and humanitarian factors would continue to intertwine, shaping the future of Ukraine, Russia, and the broader region for years to come. As winter approached in late 2023, the war in Ukraine entered a phase marked by grueling conditions, logistical challenges, and intensified international diplomacy. The colder months brought harsh weather that complicated both offensive and defensive operations. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures slowed troop movements, disrupted supply lines, and rendered some heavy machinery less effective. For soldiers on both sides, the winter campaign was not only a test of military capability, but also of endurance, resilience, and adaptability in extreme conditions. Ukrainian forces, having learned from months of conflict, implemented strategies to maximize mobility despite the harsh climate. Troops relied on smaller, highly maneuverable units capable of rapid strikes and ambushes. Drones and satellite reconnaissance became even more critical, allowing commanders to monitor enemy movements and adjust tactics in real time. Supply chains were carefully managed, with local volunteers and humanitarian organizations helping to deliver food, medical supplies, and winter clothing to both military personnel and civilians trapped in contested areas. Russian forces, despite superior numbers and equipment, faced significant logistical strain. The extended supply lines, already stretched by months of conflict, were further challenged by snow-covered roads and freezing conditions. Vehicles and machinery required constant maintenance, while fuel and ammunition shortages increasingly hampered operational effectiveness. These difficulties slowed advances and sometimes forced Russian units to adopt defensive postures rather than pursue ambitious offensives. The winter campaign also underscored the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Civilians faced extreme hardships, including lack of heating, electricity, and access to basic necessities. Hospitals and shelters struggled to operate under constant threat of bombardment and limited resources. Internally displaced persons and those in besieged cities faced freezing conditions with inadequate shelter, while families in occupied areas endured uncertainty, restricted movement, and fear of forced recruitment or reprisal. Humanitarian corridors, though occasionally negotiated, were frequently disrupted by military operations, leaving many vulnerable populations at continued risk. Internationally, diplomatic efforts intensified alongside military developments. Western nations maintained and increased support for Ukraine, providing advanced weaponry, intelligence, and economic assistance. At the same time, global organizations and governments sought to mediate, prevent escalation, and manage the growing refugee crisis. Russia, meanwhile, continued to insist that its military operations were justified and framed Western support for Ukraine as provocative, reinforcing narratives of encirclement and threat. Negotiations were often tentative and fraught, with little concrete progress toward a ceasefire or comprehensive settlement. The winter of 2023 also brought symbolic and psychological battles. Ukrainian society, despite the hardships, demonstrated remarkable cohesion and resilience. Public displays of solidarity, local initiatives to support the military, and widespread civic engagement helped maintain morale. Cultural symbols, national holidays, and historical references were emphasized to strengthen identity and sustain hope amid the devastation. Russia, on the other hand, faced domestic criticism and international isolation, with growing scrutiny of the human and economic costs of the war. By the end of the winter campaign, it was clear that the conflict had entered a protracted, high-intensity phase. Neither side could claim decisive advantage, yet Ukraine's ability to maintain resistance under extreme conditions, combined with sustained international support, challenged Russian assumptions of a swift victory. The intersection of military operations, diplomacy, and humanitarian concerns highlighted the complex nature of modern warfare, where survival, logistics, strategy, and morale are as critical as firepower. The winter of 2023-2024 left a profound impact on Ukraine's national psyche, military strategy, and international relations. It demonstrated the resilience of the Ukrainian people, the strategic importance of preparation and adaptation, and the intricate interdependence of military, humanitarian, and diplomatic efforts. The lessons of this period would shape both the conduct of the war and the broader geopolitical landscape in the months and years to follow. As spring 2024 arrived, the war in Ukraine entered another critical phase, marked by renewed offensives, strategic recalibrations, and intensified international involvement. The thawing of winter brought logistical relief for both sides, roads cleared of snow, rivers navigable, and supply lines more manageable. Ukrainian forces, having adapted to the harsh winter conditions, were now able to launch coordinated counteroffensives in key regions, aiming to reclaim territory lost earlier in the conflict and disrupt entrenched Russian positions. The spring campaigns were characterized by a combination of conventional and asymmetric tactics. Ukrainian units employed precision strikes, artillery barrages, and drone reconnaissance to weaken Russian defensive lines before launching ground assaults. Urban centers once again became battlegrounds, with street-to-street fighting, fortification of key buildings, and clever use of terrain, giving Ukrainian forces the ability to neutralize some of Russia's numerical and equipment advantages. Russian troops, although still formidable, faced fatigue, logistical strain, and growing difficulty maintaining morale amid sustained resistance. International involvement intensified during this period. Western nations increased the supply of advanced weaponry, including long-range artillery, anti-aircraft systems, and armored vehicles, bolstering Ukraine's capacity to conduct operations with greater precision and effectiveness. Intelligence sharing continued to play a decisive role, allowing Ukrainian commanders to anticipate Russian movements, identify weak points, and coordinate targeted operations. Humanitarian aid also expanded, as refugee flows persisted and affected regions required food, medical support, and reconstruction of essential infrastructure. Diplomatically, spring 2024 saw renewed attempts at negotiation, though with limited progress. Multiple rounds of talks were attempted under the auspices of international organizations, but core issues, territorial control, Crimea's annexation, and the status of Donbass, remained unresolved. Russia maintained a rigid stance, framing its operations as defensive measures against NATO encroachment, while Ukraine and its allies insisted on respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. The diplomatic stalemate underscored that the conflict was not merely a military struggle, but a profound geopolitical confrontation with global implications. The humanitarian situation, while partially mitigated by international support, remained dire. Millions of civilians continued to live under threat in conflict zones, facing disruption to schools, hospitals, and housing. Internally displaced populations were stretched across western Ukraine, with temporary shelters and host communities struggling to meet basic needs. Civilians continued to exhibit resilience, organizing local support networks, volunteering for emergency services, and assisting soldiers on the front lines, further strengthening the social fabric in the midst of chaos. The spring offensives also had significant symbolic and psychological importance. Ukrainian successes, even if incremental, boosted morale nationally and internationally, signaling that resistance could yield tangible results. These victories were widely covered by global media, reinforcing the narrative of Ukrainian determination and tenacity. Russia, conversely, faced mounting scrutiny over military setbacks, operational errors, and the growing costs of a prolonged engagement, both in human lives and economic resources. By the end of spring 2024, the war remained far from resolved, but Ukraine had gained momentum in certain sectors of the front. The combination of domestic resilience, strategic planning, and international support had begun to shift the dynamics of the conflict, demonstrating that even a larger adversary could be checked through innovation, unity, and effective coordination. Yet the stakes remained high. Continued fighting threatened further destruction, prolonged humanitarian suffering, and deeper geopolitical entanglement. The spring of 2024 marked a period of cautious optimism for Ukraine. It highlighted the importance of adaptability, international alliances, and the integration of military and civilian efforts in modern warfare. While challenges persisted, this phase underscored that the struggle for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national identity remained alive, setting the stage for future campaigns and ongoing international engagement in the conflict. By mid-2024, the war in Ukraine had entered a complex and dynamic stage as both sides adjusted strategies in response to evolving realities on the battlefield. Ukraine, buoyed by its spring successes, sought to consolidate gains in recaptured territories, fortify defensive positions, and prepare for further counteroffensives. Urban reconstruction, clearing of mines and unexploded ordnance, and restoration of basic services became critical priorities in order to stabilize liberated areas and support returning civilians. These efforts, however, were complicated by ongoing skirmishes, artillery shelling, and intermittent missile strikes targeting key infrastructure. Russian forces, facing setbacks on multiple fronts, recalibrated their strategy. Rather than attempting large-scale rapid advances, Moscow increasingly relied on fortified defensive positions, artillery barrages, and targeted strikes designed to slow Ukrainian progress and maintain control over strategic points in Donbass, southern Ukraine, and areas near Crimea. The recalibration also reflected the strains of logistics, troop morale, and international sanctions, which had begun to erode Russia's operational flexibility. The shift in tactics signaled Moscow's recognition that the war would be prolonged and that achieving objectives would require sustained pressure rather than swift conquest. International dynamics continued to shape the conflict. Western nations remained committed to supporting Ukraine, providing both military hardware and training while coordinating intelligence sharing to enhance operational effectiveness. Economic sanctions on Russia were maintained and expanded, aimed at restricting key industries, energy exports, and financial transactions. Diplomatic channels remained open, but largely stagnant, with negotiations hampered by irreconcilable positions on territorial control, the status of Crimea, and broader security guarantees. The ongoing stalemate underscored the war's complexity. It was no longer merely a regional confrontation, but a global geopolitical struggle with enduring consequences. The humanitarian situation remained a critical concern. Civilians continued to face displacement, shortages, and the psychological trauma of living in or near conflict zones. Humanitarian organizations worked tirelessly to provide medical care, food, shelter, and support for those affected, but access was often hindered by ongoing military operations. The combined effects of war, disrupted infrastructure, and economic instability deepened suffering, particularly in contested regions, where control shifted frequently between forces. Yet, amidst this adversity, local communities demonstrated resilience, organizing volunteer networks and support systems to aid both the civilian population and the military. On the battlefield, the mid-2024 period was characterized by attritional engagements, tactical maneuvers, and localized breakthroughs. Ukraine leveraged its knowledge of terrain, mobile units, and precision strikes to pressure Russian positions, disrupt supply lines, and reclaim key towns and transport routes. Russia, in turn, utilized long-range artillery, missile strikes, and entrenched defensive networks to counter advances, creating a war of slow gains and costly confrontations. Both sides faced high casualties and logistical strain, highlighting the prolonged and exhausting nature of the conflict. The war's mid-2024 developments also had profound political and psychological effects. Ukraine's successes reinforced national unity and identity, bolstering morale among civilians and troops alike. Symbols of resistance, historical narratives, and cultural cohesion became tools to sustain determination amid adversity. Russia, conversely, faced internal challenges, including domestic criticism, growing economic pressures, and the perception that objectives set at the start of the invasion were increasingly unattainable. The conflict's protracted nature tested leadership, planning, and the ability to maintain public support on both sides. By the summer of 2024, the war in Ukraine had settled into a grueling, high-stakes phase. Ukraine continued to push forward in key regions while stabilizing previously liberated areas, and Russia focused on holding territory and countering Ukrainian gains. The interplay of military strategy, international support, humanitarian crises, and political pressure created a multi-dimensional battlefield that extended beyond the front lines. The mid-2024 period demonstrated that victory would require not only military prowess, but also resilience, strategic vision, and sustained international engagement, setting the stage for further decisive campaigns in the months ahead. By late 2024, the war in Ukraine had entered a critical and highly intense phase, with both sides engaged in sustained offensives and counteroffensives that shaped the evolving front lines. Ukraine, determined to capitalize on momentum gained in spring and mid-2024, launched a series of targeted operations designed to reclaim strategic towns, sever Russian supply lines, and weaken entrenched positions. These efforts combined conventional military tactics with the use of drones, intelligence-led strikes, and specialized units capable of rapid maneuvering, signaling a more sophisticated and coordinated approach to warfare. Russian forces, aware of Ukraine's growing effectiveness and bolstered international support for Kyiv, focused on fortifying key positions, establishing defensive perimeters, and conducting precision missile strikes against critical infrastructure. Logistics became increasingly central to Moscow's strategy, as maintaining supply lines over contested terrain was vital to sustaining their military presence. The intensity of fighting in regions like Donbass, southern Ukraine, and near the frontiers of occupied territories created a war of attrition, with both sides incurring substantial casualties and material losses. The late 2024 offensives also revealed the strategic importance of international support and diplomacy. Western nations continued to provide Ukraine with advanced weaponry, intelligence, and training, allowing Ukrainian forces to conduct complex operations with greater efficiency. Economic sanctions on Russia were intensified, targeting key sectors, trade routes, and financial institutions, increasing pressure on Moscow to maintain prolonged military operations under constrained conditions. Diplomatic efforts remained ongoing, but largely stalemated, as Russia refused to compromise on territorial claims, while Ukraine insisted on sovereignty and the return of occupied regions. Humanitarian concerns continued to dominate the social landscape. Civilians faced relentless disruption to daily life, including damage to housing, schools, and hospitals. The movement of internally displaced people persisted, with families seeking refuge in western Ukraine or abroad. Humanitarian organizations struggled to provide sufficient aid amidst ongoing hostilities, navigating dangerous front lines and destroyed infrastructure. Despite these challenges, local communities displayed remarkable resilience, creating volunteer networks, supporting military logistics, and providing assistance to the vulnerable. Late 2024 also highlighted the psychological and symbolic dimensions of the war. Ukrainian victories, even if incremental, reinforced national morale and demonstrated that resistance could yield tangible results. Public displays of solidarity, cultural initiatives, and media coverage amplified the narrative of resilience, inspiring both the domestic population and international observers. Conversely, Russia faced mounting criticism for prolonged engagement, operational setbacks, and the humanitarian toll of its actions, complicating its internal messaging and raising questions about long-term strategic objectives. The global implications of the conflict remained profound. Energy markets, previously destabilized by sanctions and supply disruptions, continued to experience volatility. Food exports from Ukraine, particularly grain, were affected, prompting international concern over global food security. Nations worldwide were compelled to recalibrate foreign policy and defense strategies in light of the ongoing war, recognizing that the conflict's effects extended far beyond Eastern Europe. By the end of 2024, the war had become a complex interplay of military, humanitarian, and geopolitical factors. Ukraine's ongoing offensives, combined with international support and strategic planning, demonstrated that the conflict was not static, while Russia's recalibration revealed the limits of its initial assumptions about the war. The late 2024 phase set the stage for continued high-intensity conflict, where battlefield dynamics, civilian resilience, and international intervention would continue to shape the trajectory of the war, leaving no clear endpoint in sight and underscoring the enduring struggle for sovereignty, control, and survival in Ukraine. As 2025 began, the war in Ukraine entered another pivotal stage, with both sides adjusting strategies in response to the prolonged conflict and the evolving geopolitical landscape. Ukrainian forces, having consolidated gains from late 2024, continued to fortify reclaimed territories while planning precise offensives to exploit weaknesses in Russian lines. These operations were increasingly coordinated, with intelligence from Western allies, the deployment of advanced weaponry, and integration of specialized units trained in urban and guerrilla-style warfare, reflecting a more sophisticated and adaptive military strategy. Russian forces, on the other hand, sought to regain momentum by reinforcing defensive positions, repositioning troops, and conducting targeted strikes to disrupt Ukrainian supply chains. While Moscow retained numerical superiority in heavy artillery, logistical challenges, troop fatigue, and the persistent effectiveness of Ukrainian resistance hindered the execution of large-scale offensives. The war had shifted from rapid territorial advances to a protracted struggle of attrition where control over strategic points, transportation hubs, and urban areas became decisive. Internationally, support for Ukraine remained strong and multifaceted. Western nations continued providing advanced missile systems, drones, armored vehicles, and intelligence, enabling Kiev to mount more effective operations and counter Russian offensives. Economic sanctions against Russia were expanded, targeting key sectors including energy, banking, and high-tech industries, while diplomatic efforts focused on maintaining alliances, coordinating aid, and addressing the growing humanitarian crisis. The global community closely monitored the conflict, aware that escalation could have far-reaching consequences for regional stability and international security. The humanitarian situation persisted as a central concern. Civilians in contested zones faced displacement, shortages of food and medical care, and ongoing psychological trauma from bombardments and occupation. Internally displaced populations in western Ukraine and neighboring countries continued to rely on temporary shelters and international aid. Despite these challenges, Ukrainian communities demonstrated remarkable resilience, organizing volunteer networks, providing logistical support for the military, and maintaining social cohesion under extreme stress. The winter and early spring campaigns of 2025 also highlighted the symbolic and psychological dimensions of the war. Ukrainian successes, even in incremental gains, bolstered national morale and reinforced the narrative of determination and resistance. Public support for the government and military remained high, fueled by both tangible victories and the shared experience of enduring hardship. Russian setbacks, conversely, created internal challenges, including criticism of leadership, declining troop morale, and increased scrutiny over the prolonged nature of the campaign. On the battlefield, operations in early 2025 were characterized by intense localized engagements, with both sides incurring significant casualties. Urban centers, transport corridors, and strategic towns remained focal points, with Ukrainian forces applying combined arms tactics, precision strikes, and intelligence-led maneuvers to disrupt Russian operations. Russia continued to rely on artillery, missile strikes, and fortified positions, creating a grueling environment of attritional warfare where small territorial gains were hard-won and costly. By mid-2025, the conflict had solidified into a protracted, high-intensity struggle. Ukraine's continued resistance, strategic planning, and international support had begun to challenge Russian assumptions of quick victory, demonstrating that determination, adaptability, and coordination could offset material and numerical disadvantages. Yet the war remained unresolved, with humanitarian crises, territorial disputes, and geopolitical tensions persisting. The early months of 2025 underscored the complex interplay of military, political, and social factors in the conflict, setting the stage for further campaigns and decisive developments in the months ahead. By mid-2025, the war in Ukraine had entered a protracted and grueling phase, with both Ukrainian and Russian forces adjusting tactics to the realities of prolonged combat. Ukrainian forces, having refined their strategies over the previous years, launched a series of coordinated counteroffensives in key regions where Russian positions were most vulnerable. These operations combined conventional assaults with intelligence-driven strikes, precision artillery, and drone reconnaissance, allowing Ukrainian commanders to target supply lines, command centers, and logistical hubs, while minimizing exposure to large-scale frontal attacks. Russian forces, despite maintaining numerical superiority in certain sectors, faced mounting challenges. Supply chains were increasingly strained, troop morale fluctuated, and the attritional nature of the conflict had exposed weaknesses in operational planning. Moscow relied heavily on fortified defensive positions, artillery bombardments, and targeted missile strikes to slow Ukrainian advances. In some contested towns, both sides engaged in protracted urban warfare, with control shifting back and forth, demonstrating the grinding and unpredictable nature of the mid-2025 battlefield. The international dimension of the conflict continued to play a decisive role. Western allies maintained and expanded military support, providing advanced weaponry, intelligence, and logistical assistance, enabling Ukraine to sustain counteroffensives and defend newly reclaimed territories. Sanctions against Russia intensified, targeting energy, banking, and industrial sectors, further straining its ability to sustain prolonged operations. Diplomatic channels remained active, but largely stalemated, as the core issues of territorial control, Crimea and Donbass, remained unresolved, emphasizing the geopolitical complexity of the conflict. Humanitarian conditions remained dire, particularly in regions directly affected by ongoing combat. Civilians faced displacement, destruction of housing, interrupted access to food and medicine, and psychological trauma. Humanitarian organizations struggled to deliver aid under constant threat, while internally displaced populations in western Ukraine and neighboring countries relied heavily on temporary shelters and community support. Despite these hardships, local communities demonstrated remarkable resilience, organizing volunteer networks to assist both civilians and military personnel, reinforcing the social cohesion essential for enduring a protracted conflict. The mid-2025 counteroffensives were also significant in shaping the psychological and symbolic dimensions of the war. Ukrainian successes, though often incremental, reinforced national morale and the narrative of resistance, inspiring both domestic and international support. Russia, conversely, faced increasing scrutiny over setbacks and the prolonged human and economic costs of the war, leading to internal criticism and questions about the feasibility of long-term objectives. On the battlefield, the focus shifted toward attritional engagements, with both sides seeking to consolidate territory and gain strategic advantages rather than pursuing rapid territorial expansion. Urban centers, transport corridors, and logistical hubs became key points of contention, with Ukraine exploiting tactical flexibility, local knowledge, and intelligence support to challenge entrenched Russian forces. Russia's reliance on artillery and missile strikes created a continuous cycle of destruction, prolonging both military and civilian suffering. By late summer 2025, the war had solidified into a drawn-out, high-intensity conflict, defined by localized victories, strategic maneuvering, and a persistent struggle for momentum. Ukraine's ability to sustain counteroffensives, combined with international support and civilian resilience, challenged Russian assumptions of swift victory and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated strategy in modern warfare. Yet the humanitarian, political, and military challenges remained immense, highlighting the multifaceted nature of the conflict and the uncertain path toward resolution. If you found this chapter insightful, don't forget to turn on notifications and subscribe to History Release for more detailed accounts of world history and conflicts.